All right, welcome everyone. It is July of 2023, and we are reading Flatline Constructs, Gothic Materialism and Cybernetic Theory Fiction by Mark Fisher. It's his dissertation, and we're closing in on the end of the book. Today, we're going to talk about the chapter entitled Black Mirror. But before we get started, this actually might appear on one of our channels, either the Acid Horizon channel or the Zero Books channel. And I just wanted to make an announcement that starting next month on the Acid Horizon Patreon, the Acid Horizon channel, we will be conducting two new reading groups. One will be Gilles Deleuze, Nietzsche and Philosophy, and there will also be a new reading group starting up, which is Madness and Civilization, Michel Foucault. And the Deleuze reading group will supplant the 1,000 Plateaus reading group, which will finish up this month. And the Foucault reading group will be a brand new reading group. It just starts. We haven't determined what day of the week or what week of the month it's going to start yet. But look out for that very soon. We'll have some details on that in the coming days or so. And so just become a patron at the $1 level on Acid Horizon, and that's a way you can join. And if you're listening to this and you're like, I don't want to spend a lot of money to join a reading group, just DM me, find me on Twitter, and we'll get you in somehow. So with that said, we'll get everyone started on today's reading group, which is Flatline Constructs. But Adam and I thought it would be a good idea to talk about Baudrillard first, because Fisher's leaning quite heavily on the work of Baudrillard, particularly Baudrillard's idea of the simulacra. And we actually did an episode with Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour where we talked somewhat extensively about chapter 2 of Symbolic Exchange and Death, Baudrillard's book, and the 3 orders of simulacra. And I don't know, I've talked quite a bit already. I have something prepared, but maybe I'll pass it to Adam to get us started on talking about how and why Baudrillard is important to Fisher here, and then we'll flesh out a little bit of Baudrillard's concept before talking about the way that Fisher uses him in this chapter.
Well, Baudrillard is fundamentally one of the sort of biggest figures in Flatline Constructs because he presents a similar kind of cybernetic realist outlook as Fisher's other sort of main influences here, which is Deleuze and Guattari, but from a predominantly more, to extent more literary in terms of Baudrillard is looking at writers, for example, like J.G. Ballard, who will appear constantly throughout this dissertation. But also he's the more pessimistic side of things. He is looking at communications theory certainly more in-depth manner, but necessarily a more Bataillean manner, somewhat more tied to ideas of modes of production in a more typical Marxist way of thinking about it. And of course, he influences some of the biggest kinds of cyberpunk literature, not only The Matrix, but of course the CCRU, which is the department in which Fisher is writing this dissertation. The idea of the more real than real, hyper-reality. And I think just to take a little sort of detour on hyper-reality a little bit, there's a tendency when people invoke Baudrillardian sort of terms or terms in a Baudrillardian sort of context, such as simulation, simulacra, the idea that things are copies or they're copies of copies. And that means that in a way they're illusory or not real. The hyperreal is more real than real, not because it's fake, but because it is in any way that we can verify it, more real than real. Because a hyperreal aspect essentially embodies the image more perfectly than the real thing itself. This is, for example, what people talk about Trump in this way. Trump is so noxiously American; it feels almost more. It doesn't feel unreal. It feels more real than real. He brings all the football teams to the White House and just this giant plate of McDonald's. He's a billionaire with like fake everything. It's too real. This is what J.G. Ballard will also do with his story, Why I Want to Fuck Ronald Reagan, which is famously distributed as a prank at Republican convention. And they say, well, this is perfectly fine. This is a perfectly good analysis of the appeal of Ronald Reagan, himself an actor who is not simply playing a copy of himself as a real person by acting, but is also modifying himself. His media image is feeding back into his own performance on the political stage, and therefore he becomes overdetermined by images of himself. He becomes more real than real, because the real Reagan that we see every day, well, we would have seen every day, real Trump, is always mediated by screens, editorial lines, and forms of media. To go back to Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message, not the other way around. So Baudrillard, just to focus on some of the main aspects of what we call hyperreality, we need to go back to the idea of a simulation, which we can roughly say is a copy, and the simulacra as a copy of a copy. Now, in terms of the history of this idea of a simulacra, well, a simulacrum is plural. The copy of the copy keeps metamorphosizing throughout the history of production, history of culture, and history of how we relate to signs. So to take the first order of simulacra, the first order of copies, the first kind of copy of a copy that Baudrillard talks about is a counterfeit. So the example always uses like a Gucci bag. A Gucci bag is a copy of a sort of prototypical bag or a standard model of the bag, and that the copying of that real bag, the copying of the prototype, is something that's sanctioned by the authority of the name. The Gucci name standing in for a kind of feudal household, in the same way that sort of older or sort of medieval systems would sanction something on the basis of it is the authority of the name, the House of Windsor, say, And a counterfeit is a copy of a copy, because a counterfeit Gucci bag is a copy of a Gucci bag. A Gucci bag is a copy of the prototype, and the transfer, the creation of this copy is sanctioned by the owner, the proprietor, the authority of the name Gucci. Now, in a counterfeit Gucci bag, the authority is there's no relation there. The first term of the sequence of copies, the real aspect of it, the Gucci bag that a Gucci bag really is a copy of, is completely absent. That sanction is broken, and therefore a copy of a copy is a counterfeit. So just to recap here, what allows the copy to not be a copy of a copy, to actually stand in for the real thing or to be equivalent to the real thing, is for it to be sanctioned by a kind of top-down authority of the name, which really crafts or assigns a sign its value. Now, this is pretty easy when there's only a few people who can make these kind of things. It's more artisanal. It's very hard to do. The knowledge is very gate-kept within certain kinds of boundaries. It's much harder when we have more malleable kinds of building materials, such that we can make copies a lot easier. So the example that he gives is stucco, like plaster casting. I mean, in the V&A Museum in London, there's a thing called the cast courts, which is all of these grand monuments, coffins, pillars. Yeah, for once we didn't fucking steal the things, but this time they just made a plaster cast of all of them. And you go, okay, we can make copies of things now. We can make copies of copies. So like something looks like a Gucci bag out of stucco, maybe, or out of Play-Doh. And this kind of changes the relation to the original, insofar as, okay, how do we know it's really an X? If I make a plaster cast of what's an interesting statue? Michelangelo's David. I make a plaster cast of Michelangelo's David, and someone walks up and says, that's Michelangelo's David. It's not Michelangelo's David because Michelangelo has sanctioned this copy being made of this copy. No, it's a copy of a copy. It's not it's a reproduction of it with different material, but nonetheless, you can verify that it is Michelangelo's David. You can point at it and say that, not because it's tied by the authority of a name, but because it exhibits the same formal qualities. And this is the theory of formation that goes back to Aristotle. So, Aristotle's theory of hylomorphism, hylos, matter, morphos, form. It's like a wax. You take a stamp, you seal the wax, the form is imprinted on the wax. It's what identifies the thing as what it is these formal morphological qualities. And so a copy of a copy is no longer so much a counterfeit as it is what can be a counterfeit, because the feudalism doesn't go away, but it can also be a replication. It can still bear a relationship to the original by virtue of copying, being a copy of a copy, which keeps certain essential formal qualities. It's translated not from sort of the authority of the name, but into an essential set of qualities which determine the image of that thing. Now, The third order of a simulacra, this is when things get really kind of wibbly wobbly and fucked up, because machines come in, and what do people do? They speculate on what machines can do. They're just told to produce. They're told to fulfill certain functions. There doesn't need to necessarily be, an authority directing it in the same way it would have like a continuity of tradition from a feudal artisan or even from an artist. You can take a rough prototype but just keep stamping it out on any material. And the question here is, how do we what is a copy of a copy in the industrial context? I think it's easier to jump through the hoops of doing 19th century capitalism here and just talk about data more instead. A copy of a copy is a simulacrum in the online space we're talking about now. So, we're constantly reproducing data. We're producing it right now. What is data? Sort of translating the movements of our fingers and intellectual sort of movements as well into online platforms. We're basically using the code of an online platform. We're modifying it to explore, not necessarily modifying the code, but we're modifying it without changing the body of the code, what Deleuze and Guattari would call an expression, to project something of ourselves out into it or produce content. Now that's simple enough. That's just a copy of us. On my Facebook profile, in a way, is me copying myself into that data. Some people's Twitter accounts are them copying themselves into data. So is Instagram, photography, especially circulated online. And we copy ourselves into data in order to circulate those images of ourselves around to receive affirmation, feedback, and the like. Maybe to piss people off, to have some fun with it. And the copy of the copy in this case is not actually anything counterfeit, or it's not a counterfeit version of ourselves. It's not even necessarily a distinct version of ourselves with the same qualities. It doesn't need to be. Rather, the copy of the copy in this case happens when the thing we're translating ourselves into, cyberspace, as we call it. It used to be the realm of the image, realm of art. Now it's just cyberspace. Translating ourselves into that ultimately means that cyberspace can feed back into the real, feedback into the person on the other side of the screen. This is very important for Fisher, because Fisher's talking about the Gothic flatline, the black mirror, the screen, because the screen is no longer a barrier between the cyberspace and the world, between sort of a world of images and a world of us outside of it, experiencing them. Rather, the screen is not about a barrier, it's a site of interaction between the two. If you want to think about server banks and all the material infrastructure of the internet, think about it like pillars or layers of sediment which form a strata, not necessarily above or maybe even alongside the real, which is cyberspace. And so the copy of, just to go back to the idea of the simulacrum, I think for Fisher is going to be this what I like to call, and he likes to call as well, new flesh. The idea that humans copy themselves into data, and then they start acting as if, like data. They get feedback on their personality, which they send out into cyberspace. That feedback is sent sort of back through the screen, and people modify their behaviors. This can be good or bad, of course. People learn a lot through the internet. We can have great solidarity. We're learning things right now. But this is both the danger and the exciting part of Fish, that we are becoming simulacra. We are being detached from the real identity of the classical bourgeois subject, and we're actually translating ourselves into data, which means that, to an extent, if we're translating ourselves into cyberspace, we're ultimately producing things that can feed back upon us and then determine us in turn. The question is, can we do this in a way that is emancipatory, or will we be captured in circuits of addiction, sort of poster's brain in a way, complete cybernetic capture, complete imaginatory capture, especially under the sort of ideas of platform capitalism? And this is the question which will stick with Fisher all the way up to acid communism, the revolutionary potential of the cybernetic, or is it really the space for which, as Fisher would say, we become subject to what he calls hyper control? But I'm sorry, I've gone for a long time there, but that's the gist of the Baudrillardian cybernetics.
Sure. Maybe I'll just fill in a couple of blanks. There's really not much more to add that I think will avail us here today. But I think it's important to keep in mind that what Baudrillard is attempting to do is show the historical evolution of the emancipation of signs, through different regimes of signs. And as Adam aptly pointed out, we have what we could call the counterfeit regime. To what extent does a sign and a referent correspond to one another? And, some examples of this is like, in pre-capitalist societies, something like the crucifix, for example, it was unambiguously refers to, the death of Christ and all of the reference around that. And then with the emergence of things like stucco as a kind of universal substance through which the regime of counterfeits could be created. We could make a statue, we could make a kind of wood cornice work or molding, something that would ordinarily be made out of another substance. I think one of the important examples that Baudrillard gives in Symbolic Exchange and Death is the creation of this garden of objects made completely out of concrete, right? One of the interesting parallels or parallelisms that we get in Baudrillard's text and the way that we can read Baudrillard as a kind of Marxist is the way in which the emancipation of the sign runs parallel to the emancipation of a certain kind of political subject, although seemingly interminably bound within the strictures of capitalism, as we'll see. But with the emergence of the industrial order, we do have an emancipation of the system of signs through the creation of the automaton or the robot, essentially. And I see this as mapping quite closely to Marx's notion of fixed capital. The idea that we create the machines that capitalists then use to replace laborers. And what I think is interesting about that is, the industrial simulacrum is typified by these relations of equivalences and indifference, and it becomes unmoored from the counterfeit relations. So what we see is the sign moving away from the strictures of a very clear and distinct reference, now coming out and having a kind of autonomy and an ability to create a kind of value that's on par with the laborers. So basically, laborers and automatons are competing with one another for the ability to produce certain kinds of goods, and products. But it's not only products. There's something else here that Baudrillard adds that Baudrillard perhaps believes is an oversight in Marx's system, which is that the concept of use value is transcended in a certain way, in that the sign or the production of signs goes beyond that. And so what happens is the simulacrum gives way to what Baudrillard calls this vertiginous delirium, this experience in the absence of a referential reason. And one of the things that Marx and some Marxists would suggest is that once the proletariat realizes the conditions by which it is oppressed and the rationality which undergirds capital, once it's understood and realized, that would then precipitate the proletariat then overcoming the bourgeoisie and then installing the dictatorship of the proletariat and what have you. But one of the things that Baudrillard says is what Marx failed to consider was the power of semio-capital, is that in the development of the capital-labor relation, we also have a further emancipation of the sign into hyperreality going forward. And it's by this that Baudrillard's able to articulate what he calls the metaphysics of code. And I think some of the interesting things that appear in Fisher's work here, and maybe some of the ways to fill in the blanks, with respect to Adam's description, is that code, the finality, the notion that code has a certain finality is either overcome or destroyed in this revelation, right? Code becomes modular. It becomes, something that's not attached specifically to a referent. It can be mobilized in the form of commodities. It can be transformed and so on. And so the resolution of the world into code is the unification of the world into this kind of homogeneous substance of code. And Baudrillard also goes on to say that the system of infinite reproduction puts an end to the myth of an origin or an end, even evacuating the notion of capitalism's origin and end. And so this idea that there was a way to overcome capital by questioning its rationality is put to an end. It's short-circuited by the presupposition birthed by capital, which is the emergence of code as this kind of indeterminate or aleatory force. And maybe one of the things that we can talk about, and I know Fisher hits upon here a little bit, is Baudrillard's interest in the test subject and questionnaires and that sort of thing as a method of feedback. And one of the things that Baudrillard hits upon in Symbolic Exchange and Death is the idea of like the audience as a kind of critic. Like here's a film, you'll be given a questionnaire afterwards, about the film, and it's going to ask you yes or no, or that sort of thing. And maybe there's even an area to fill in a little bit of a blank. And anybody who's lived in Los Angeles or New York and has been to one of these film screenings, maybe you've experienced this kind of thing. But one of the things that Baudrillard says is that in the construction of these tests, certain axes of knowledge or axes of understanding are delineated. It becomes like a circuit. Like, was it good? Yes or no? Did it evoke this feeling within you? Yes or no? And those kinds of questions basically dissolve any sort of ambiguities that we had around the signs. So there's a way in which the notion of hyperreality and this emancipation of a code brings about the conditions by which code can be deployed as a method of social control. And so we'll probably talk a little bit more about that with feedback loops and what have you. But I've talked quite a bit. I'll pass it back to Adam before we open it to others in the group. Adam, is there anything that you wanted to fill in there?
Yeah, just quick. I mean, and just to give another example, which I use quite a bit, talk about sort of the idea of hyperreality. So someone tells someone tells someone else a joke. One person says "lol." Now, "lol" is an interesting case for people where people sort of say it instead of laughing, because originally "lol" is just a copy. It's a copy. It's a translation of it. It represents an event of laughter. However, sort of if you spend enough time online, you see sort of jokes all the time. You're probably not laughing too much, but some people who say are so cybernetically or so sort of constantly online that they may say "lol" instead of laughing. Well, if you do that, then "lol" no longer represents laughing. You're saying it because it's representing the word "lol," which no longer refers to an original event of laughter, or not necessarily has to. It's almost because ultimately you're relying on the data first and foremost. Okay, because that is the thing that says that is the function. It now serves a pure function, and laughter may, in a way, only need to happen to now serve the function you're referring to. You laugh to say that no, there really has been a "lol" here because I've laughed. So it is this great inversion. It's very similar. It's very similar to the idea as well. So it's raining. You check the forecast on your phone. You say, "Oh, it's not raining." You look outside. You see water falling from the sky, and you go, "Well, that can't be right." It is using the platform or taking the data or the map instead of the territory. The mapping is fundamentally too much for the data is fundamentally supplementing the real. This is very much the case in. How many fucking news stories are basically made up Twitter reporting? Or how many times does a journalist report? Well, let's say a journalist, someone like a Rupert Murdoch kind of journalist, will simply say something and then it will essentially become real because it is verifiable only against reporting in the press. Therefore, if it is written down in the press, the event is sort of retrospectively posited because the real thing is the reporting. They do this all the time with smear campaigns, scapegoating, ultimately, and say this has been alleged. Like it's typical libel stuff, and then regardless of the reference to like a real event, it then becomes sort of a stick to kind of, for example, to beat the left with, for example. But that's just another example.
Right. Yeah, and we will now talk a little bit about how Mark Fisher mobilizes this theory in his discussion of Black Mirror, hypernaturalism, hyperreality, and hyperfiction. I wanted to just put it out there. If anyone had any questions, comments, concerns, something that they thought was interesting or stood out to them in the text, by all means, like now's a great time to jump in. There might even be stuff in the chat already. So if you have something that you want to say, by all means, just jump right in or do a little hand raise, and that will get us going on it. One of the things that I thought was quite interesting about this chapter is the question of metaphor, because the emancipation of the sign is it's unbounding itself, unmooring itself from a system of references. And in Deleuze and Guattari's work, as representing the positive end of the Gothic materialism, they themselves want to look at signs in terms of something that goes beyond metaphor. So for anyone who's done the 1,000 Plateaus reading group with us, if you remember the plateau on the rhizome, where they talk about the book as a kind of writing machine. It's not simply something that represents what is being said, but often in many cases attempts to effectuate, I mean, as a political text, as a theoretical text, even as a metaphysical text, tries to effectuate or evince the very values which are being written about, or create the kinds of affects or percepts by which to create a desubjectified subject, for example. One of the things that Fisher says here is, why should cybernetic fiction bring the end of metaphor? To understand something of what is at stake here, it might be useful to compare Gibson with one of Baudrillard's favorite authors of simulation, Jorge Luis Borges. And so what Fisher is attempting to do here, and which I think is really novel use of not only Deleuze and Guattari, but Baudrillard, is to show how this evacuation of metaphor has implications for cybernetics and this, his own concept of Gothic materialism. But I'm just going to take a quick look at the chat right now. And if anybody had any questions, comments, discussion on the Baudrillard bit, I mean, feel free to jump in at this time. And that includes you too, Adam, if you want to hop in there too.
I mean, if anyone has any questions on metaphor, I mean, the idea of flattening down metaphor is kind of the beating heart of a lot of this. I think it's exactly what Deleuze and Guattari mean. They keep saying, like, this is not a metaphor, and they mean it's not a metaphor because it's something even more confusing. It's a diagram, because it's similar way that you can do like circuit diagrams, flow charts, insofar as everything is assigned a function or a functionality. Everything, insofar as we can connect with images through the screen, it is just a horizontal, not necessarily a horizontalization, but a flattening or an indifference to that difference. Metaphor is no longer something is something's acting like this. Something is like this. Metaphor is something about resemblance, but actually resemblance isn't about representing or fundamentally representing a transcendental part of experience, something which has sort of an existence, sort of not necessarily in itself, for itself, maybe. And I'm losing my German terminology here. But ultimately, when under cybernetic reading, metaphor and representation are just one function above others. Metaphor, for example, and representations become the function of standing in for something, or producing a certain kind of affect by using a metaphor. So it's like I'm not in my poetic mood today. Metaphors aren't my strong suit, but this collapsing of metaphor is ultimately going to be the real thing which justifies Fisher talking about the idea of the flatline, the screen as a place which is continuous with the world, an additional stratum of the world. To use the terms of loosely sort of frontier, I guess, someone like Sadie Plant, his supervisor, will talk about this. I mean, there's a great quote actually on 143, which is, cyberspace is fully a part of the world in a very real economic sense. In an inversion, Baudrillard would appreciate it would perhaps be better to reverse the emphasis. Now, actual goods function as second-order copies of the data that can be accessed raw in cyberspace. This, after all, is the point of data hacking. Data can be treated as primary, as itself a commodity. And there's another quote from the same page. Cyberspace is continuous with the world, not different from it. Feedback ensures that the operational or the cybernetic relationship between the simulated realm destroys any illusion of difference, denying metaphor its grounds. And essentially, in order to have metaphor, we need sort of a hard and fast distinction between sort of the fictional and non-fictional, which is incredibly blurred. Another quote from Fisher, it's in the footnote to page 140. The possibility of metaphor implies commitment to a reality principle, whose underlying assumption is the belief that reality is no longer under production. Now, this is him very much under the influence of Nick Land, particularly the idea of reading things in terms of Kant. So Kant, that's a 140 footnote. Kant here's the idea that reality is already not really under production anymore. We have the conditions of experience to stabilize all experience into these basic categories and basic forms of ordering, cause and effect. We're never going to see anything sort of new in this sense. Or if we do, we have to conform to these conditions. Whereas in the Baudrillardian sense or in the Fisherian sense, reality is actually something that's constantly produced. The stability of the real is something that's constantly produced, and it's reproduced according to a mode of production of reality. Not in the sense that we totally produce everything, but in terms of our experience of it, the way in which sort of the material world is coded and the productions which sort of intervene on it and turn it into other things, literally turning the natural world, turning a pig into bacon requires a certain machinic relation of inputs and outputs, and therefore say that reality is actually something which is under production is even more true in the case of cybernetics, because the fictions we put out on there, the data we create, feeds back into the world. This is definitely the case. I mean, Elon Musk is a good example of this. He's never needed to actually do any of the stuff. He sells the image that he's going to do the stuff, and it makes just as much money, and it gets just as much people going for it. You just need the image now. Ultimately, capitalism doesn't need. I mean, as Fisher would go on to say in Capitalist Realism, capitalism. Oh no, sorry, this is Terminator versus Avatar. He says this: capitalism sort of cannot promise a future because it cannot deliver one. Or it cannot deliver it, but essentially it cannot deliver the future. It's incapable of doing so because it's fundamentally only needs to put forward the image of it, or to code the future in a certain way, or to code the possibility of the future in a way which reproduces that society. It isn't a sort of relapse into idealism, but it is talking about the real material conditions under which our social reality, because as a good Deleuze-Guattarian, he thinks that desire and the social are all we can really talk about in any strong materialist sense, because materialism isn't just a theory of matter, it's a theory of the relations. Fundamentally, it may not even be a theory of matter, ultimately. I mean, Marx and Engels, or especially Marx in the Thesis on Feuerbach, essentially reduces the material to social relations of sensuous human existence. He's not necessarily as concerned as he would be sort of a few years before with the nature of matter. Is it dynamic? Is it mechanical? And this is something that we talked about with Thomas Nail a while back. But yeah, just any questions anyone has on the sort of metaphorical aspect. Of course, there's the J.G. Ballard stuff we mentioned, Borges, the map and the territory. There's some interesting stuff in there about reality TV as well, which Fisher was definitely love to focus on in his later work. Of course, we have also ideas like about opinion polling and hyper control. There's a not so much a spectre, but a lingering presence of William S. Burroughs in this.
Well, we have Douglas. Go ahead, Douglas.
Yeah, I think this is like this question of the evacuation of metaphor and like the becoming hyper real of the simulacrum. This is like, exactly kind of what is a bit confusing to me. And these questions of grounding of reality that it brings up. Some quotes that I wrote down from Mark Fisher. This was like pages 146 and 147. Baudrillard's point is that there is no image of the real which does not participate in and therefore affect what it is supposedly representing, therefore no more representation. And there are no spectators and no spectacle. You participate whether you like it or not. Nothing is outside the loop, right? And so it's kind of a question to me of like what still licenses us to call it more real than real versus, more fictional than fiction. And, what would be the difference between those terms besides, to me, sort of falling back on a maybe phenomenology or something like that?
No, that's a great question. I think it's not necessary, but it's important to get a sense like where this whole line of thought and this whole theoretical tendency of interrogating the metaphor, like where it comes from, how it establishes its importance, especially in French philosophy and especially amongst the French communists, even as early as somebody like Klosowski, for example. And there's a way in which we could bring in the figure of Nietzsche and maybe even Freud to a certain extent. I mean, I think where Freud had secretly parasitized Nietzsche's ideas, it actually finds a backdoor into this discussion in a way where the idea of a metaphor, it's almost Kantian in the sense like where the idea of a metaphor or a sign itself becomes the conditions for the possibility not only of an experience, but of a kind of expression. Right. And what happens is, and just to like move very quickly over like Klosowski's reading of Nietzsche is that the way that we come to understand ourselves and know ourselves as rational beings is through, a series of signs that elevate themselves to a level of what he calls a simulacrum, in some case, a stereotype, which is almost like an archetype in some sense. But at the expense of doing that, at the expense of having knowledge that comes via metaphors, we suppress a whole range of drives that don't find their expression, in signs. What's interesting about Baudrillard and Fisher here is they do something almost completely different with it. And I'm looking on page 145 right now. It's actually the sentence that bleeds over into the next page, where Baudrillard basically, or where Fisher says what Baudrillard means by hyperreality, like what are the metaphysics of it? And he says that it's the embedding structures of ontological hierarchization increasingly fail or become compromised. And using the example of media, which are of a supposedly ontologically inferior status to what they mediatize, increasingly come to influence and determine the ostensibly ontological superior real world. So it's almost as if in a historical sense, it's a return of the repressed in some way, or a revenge of the sign, insofar as the regime of the hyperreal is such that the sign no longer is pegged to this notion of reference or correspondence, but it functions in circuit with everything else, other bodies within the real, almost in a way where it entifies. It becomes a function. It becomes part of the machine, and it's not strictly a kind of reference. And I think Fisher notes here that Baudrillard notes that I think there's a way in which we imagine the real and the regime of signs of the hyperreal as interpenetrated in some way, although we don't get a sort of like distinct metaphysical or ontological mapping of how that happens. They are happening conterminously, they are happening concomitantly, but nonetheless, I like the idea that there's a kind of inversion where the signs, once considered to be inferior to the real objects, are now interacting with the plethora of things that exist in reality, almost as equals in some sense.
And isn't that the tough part, though, to do that inversion without flipping all the way back around and just reversing terms and winding up with the same structure you started with?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it's less a matter of reference per se, because there's a way in which, so going back to the Klosowski example, when we think about signs as just metaphors or as a kind of lens, a phenomenological lens through which to interpret experience, it presupposes a lack of functional efficacy of the sign itself. It automatically subordinates it. So I would say that the presupposition is that the sign is subordinated, and it fails to consider that the sign does have a functional element. And when mobilized by something like capital, for example, well, then we can see the full range of efficacy of these signs and their utility.
Maybe another way to say it is that, like, if you think you're just actively as an agent reversing the terms, you're missing the fact that the terms are like doing work behind your back and
Something like that. Yeah, something like that.
It's the logic of verification fundamentally. The question is, how do you know a Gucci bag is a Gucci bag? It's been sanctioned, it's a copy of the real one, and therefore there's a fundamental equivalence, at least a semiotic equivalence. They both signify, one signifies the other. There's a equivalence there. We say that is a Gucci bag. That judgment identifies that. It's also epistemological in the sense of sort of how do you know? It's similar to a scientific experiment. What is a scientific experiment? It copies the real. It reproduces the real under experimental conditions. And if you can reproduce that reproduction, then the scientific community is more of a case for its verifiability. It's a very inductive mode of thinking about it, and it's thinking about it in terms of economics as well. The capital ultimately reduces everything to an equivalence in value or an equivalence in money, and I think the question of how do you know here? If something's more real than real, the idea is that the map, in a way, precedes the territory now. And then rather than verifying like something against the territory, you end up verifying against the map, because the map, in a way, is more real than the real in terms of how do you know. Very similar to how we talk about sort of data these days. It's the data is more real than real. It's almost like what was that? There was a great joke about 1840, I think it was 1840s, 1848. There was a joke of everyone storming the imperial palace in Vienna, and the emperor turned, and the Metternich, the chancellor, turns to the emperor and says, "And my emperor, the people are storming the palace." And the emperor goes, "Well, they're not allowed to do that, are they?" The laws become the law becomes sort of more real than the actual political territory, which is fatal in feudal societies, because ultimately the power base there's a core real there. But the idea of us capturing people semiotically, people try and verify as, okay, where's this process? They check on their phones, for example. This isn't an anti-phone diatribe. Baudrillard is way more pessimistic than myself or Craig on this. He thinks it's very hard to escape, which is why you've got to do signal jamming, scrambling there. But in terms of verifying what's real, if you end up verifying it amongst a copy, and everything you use to verify things around you is purely mediated, and the media are so sort of intense in their production, you only have other signs to grab onto, then you sort of lose that ground. But Baudrillard doesn't want to return to that ground. I think it opens up new weapons, but he's also very pessimistic about it.
Sorry. I think a good way to get a sense of Baudrillard's political commitments with respect to that is actually to return to chapter 2 of Symbolic Exchange and Death at the very end, where he talks about the insurrection of signs, particularly through tagging and some kinds of graffiti. And now, having had the benefit of maybe living 35 to 40 years, maybe even 45 years plus beyond when that text was originally written, I mean, we can see the extent to which, not only graffiti itself, but graffiti culture has been fully subsumed under capital and, has been redeployed in the commodity form. Although that said, I still think there's an argument, and I'm looking actually at my notes right now on Symbolic Exchange and Death. There is an argument to be made that there are varying gradations of graffiti. And I would say that which is more on the tagging end of things, that has a sort of profane aesthetic value, that which doesn't look colorful or has all of the flourishes of what we ordinarily to associate with, like the graffiti that you see in, like any of the 80s movies about breakdancing, for example. That kind of art and that sort of like that kind of tagging is what local business owners, they don't want to see that. Of course, though, however, we can set up a mural like within the Old Town area, or the newly developed like promenade area. Yeah, maybe we can have a mural with some graffiti there. So there's a way, in which, not only to allocate, but, capture that method of insurrection and redeploy it as a cultural artifact. But regardless of that, I think Baudrillard is somewhat committed to the idea that there can be a kind of revolt against the semiocracy through different kinds of redeployments of signification by injecting into the system of semiocracy indeterminacy, a kind of code that's retaliatory in some ways. But what that looks like, well, it could be a number of things. Does that mean publishing a book on established book, with an established book publisher? Maybe, maybe not. Like, what does that look like today to put out a kind of sign that's completely antagonistic to the sacred space of capital, that completely profanes the semiocracy in some way?
Speaking of the production of coding things and scribing them into those kind of fields, I mean, it's a question, something in the chat from Greg about. I mean, Greg, you can read this out if you want, but I find it really interesting about sort of Fisher maybe doesn't go into the actual mechanics of copying. So it's in the digital realm, the data can be copied endlessly with no loss of information. But as we see all the time, the meaning is lost eventually, and a recipient of a copy at somewhere down the line has no idea what the context of the original was. I think honestly, I think that's it. I mean, I think he does talk about something adjacent to this, or maybe that might help understand this a little bit earlier in the text. It's the idea of a surplus value of code. And it's very similar to how sort of viruses commutate in a way. Like virus, as I found this lovely phrase actually in a virology textbook the other day, that retroviruses can't proofread. They can inscribe a little something extra into the gene of a cell. They can't proofread it. If it's fucked up, it's fucked up. And the possibility of mutation and contagion is exactly this. Similar to the idea of, the old Twitter joke. You tweet out, I love pancakes, and then someone replies, oh, so you fucking ate waffles, don't you? It is that idea of you don't have control. The author died of a word virus. The instantaneous distribution of especially text and images now, people can see, people can consume it and then reproduce it, literally retweeting it or sort of copying and pasting it instantly over a period of minutes, if not days. This, I think, really is the idea of a surplus value. You can just keep cycling things throughout these circuits, and the friction of people responding to it, inputting data into it, generates itself a kind of capital, especially that can be sold to advertisers. But sorry, Sean, I realized you had your hand up. Apologize.
Well, circling back to graffiti a little bit, as like I spent a lot of my late teens and early 20s like in a graffiti scene, and it's like very much like the idea of it being sort of like capital is captured was like sort of like a foregone conclusion, but it was really about just like a reality exchange with like your environment, like you actually taking a more proactive assertion of your like identity and putting it out there into the world by like defacing, because there's a whole code of ethics too within graffiti where you target advertising and public property. If you're like, if you're back then anyway, the code was, you try to like, you shy away from like fucking up people's personal property of businesses, and you aim at like government property and advertising, which both seem like sort of like the former being like, well, we own this shit anyway, right? And the latter being like, this is an unsanctioned occupation of my space trying to commercialize me, so I have every right to deface it. It's like a sort of self-defense of my own reality. And then also just like a wanting to sort of take an active role in sort of so much of like our identity becomes passive in that like it's like exerted upon us with the sort of illusion of activity. But like there's sort of like a skin in the game activity to graffiti where you're actually sort of, there is the subversiveness is that it is like against the law. There are repercussions for being caught. And like the idea it being a sort of like, well, like that aesthetic is going to be captured in capitalism. It's also like an arms race, and sort of like a graffiti culture was also like a expediation of like transgression of the transgression, where like when like really beautiful, colorful, like highly designed pieces became sort of popular, like there was sort of a regressive, almost like sort of out, like making things really like gross and juvenile and weird and disgusting again. And so it is like graffiti culture is just this really interesting sort of like has this really interesting discourse with capital, because it just won't go away. It continues to exist because there's like a subversive, like there's a subversive urge that can like, you know, that fosters it, but it has to kind of live within that exchange. And it like creates this sort of reality space where it's like when walls are covered in graffiti, now you're in the space of like, you don't really quite know like what's a sort of like cool cafes sanctioned mural, or like an ad for like some new weed delivery service, or actual graffiti.
Yeah, I mean, it seems the interesting thing that you said there for me was the idea that there's a kind of morality internal to the community of graph artists. You know, I'm curious, is it more explicit? Is it more implicit? Is it something learned along the way? I'm just like, how does that discourse play out amongst folks doing that sort of thing?
Yeah, my experience is it's like it's learned along the way, and it was yeah, and there's a lot of heat within that community. It's not like a community of like total solidarity, because it is a, you know, there are lots of like territory rules within that, and you know, and there's like crews too that vet up. So there's sort of there's rules within crews, and then there's transgressing those rules for purposes to express things to those crews. It's a complete internal language communicating to, it's like a sub communication that's like lost on most people, but like it's really interesting to move through any like history, like any space, and having that background and seeing a conversation existing on the walls that no one else is seeing, like who and like so-and-so's coming up, and so-and-so is beefing with so-and-so, and so-and-so's like so-and-so just called out so-and-so's girlfriend, so so-and-so's got something to say to so-and-so clearly, you know. And it's like, and yeah, and but there is like, but yeah, the sort of code, and every code is, it's like violation, because like, you know, a business that like there's like a moment where a business becomes okay to fuck up, you know, like clearly like no one's gonna say like, no, it's unethical to like do graffiti on a Starbucks roll-up door at night, but like but yeah, it's interesting like what is okay and what isn't, and it's like it's a wiggle.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm just kind of theorizing on the spot, but like the sort of plasticity of the morality suggests to me, well, I mean, for one thing, graffiti just in and of itself as an activity, as something to do, as an enterprise, is an inscriptive activity. And so it seems that it subsists, or at least the communities of people who are doing it are motivated in part by this kind of system of cruelty in the broad sense, you know, the cruelty of capitalism, but also the internal contestations. Like that's what kind of keeps the libido flowing there, you know, like it's a territorial activity in some sense, you know, and to, you know, find the right space to do something, you know, means that somebody else doesn't get to use that space. And
yeah. Also, yeah, stealing your materials is actually a huge part of it too. It's a whole aspect of the culture, like called racking, where like, you know, you figure out ways to not pay for the materials you're using to create the art. And it's like people like, you know, like people who are like had the disposable income so that they didn't have to undergo the risk of like stealing their materials and could buy it. I don't think it's the same now, but back in the day, that was sort of like a shameful thing. Like it made you less credible as an artist because you weren't willing to like, yeah, we weren't willing to, you were feeding a machine to make it.
Posers, that's what we call them. I actually wanted to quickly go back to Greg. Thank you, Sean. I wanted to go back to Greg's point very quickly before we move on with the other things, because where was the comment that Adam commented on, where Greg said, it seems that Fisher doesn't delve into the actual mechanics of the copying. In the digital realm, the data can be copied endlessly with no loss of information, but as we see all the time, the meaning is lost eventually, and recipient of a copy at somewhere down the line has no idea what the context of the original was. one of the figures functioning in the background, not only for Fisher, but also for Baudrillard, is of course Walter Benjamin and the work of art in the age of reproduction. And one of the things that I think what you're saying there, Greg, goes hand in hand with what Baudrillard says about the hyperreal, is that the inauguration of the hyperreal is the revelation that there is no finality to code, for one thing, but the thing that's sacrificed in the sort of Benjaminian sense is the aura of science, because what it does is it exposes what code is. It's reducible to this notion of inscription and coding. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, like, what does that mean? Well, it shows then that the unification of like the larger capitalist order under the semio-capital of the hyperreal, well, the hyperreal is, the semio-capital is the homogeneous substance of the hyperreal. So I think, even though Fisher isn't dealing with that explicitly on the page, I think that idea is functioning for him in the background. And we have Tom.
Hi. Yeah, I love this chapter because I make games and I think about games constantly. And I think, video games are very instructive to think about a lot of these things, because I think what separates we think of as a video game from like a Fitbit, right, is just the idea that there's an enclosed fictional universe. That's all that separates it, because otherwise it's just input and computer representation of a feedback of that input, right? And when I saw someone I know, their friend got their DNA and bloods done to kind of give them this kind of report sheet on what kind of fitness activities they should be doing, all this sorts of stuff, right? And I saw it and I thought, oh, that's just a D&D sheet, right? You've got this series of figures, right, that represent a body, right, that is meant to tell you what kind of proclivities that body is able to has in its potential abilities, right, and which ways it should grow, and what sorts of numbers you should see go up. And so I think that seeing the way in which very I'm going to say explicitly cybernetic, but immediately cybernetic technologies, rather than the pull of film, right, which is obviously cybernetic, but it comes afterwards, kind of render the body quantitatively, and how you can see the exact same rendering and intelligibility of a body, right, of an avatar in a video game, kind of I think neatly articulates the kind of the sort of dissolution of the sort of dissolution of something that I'm not quite articulating, right? But similarly, with video games as well, what you have, because there's this interesting bit about parody, right, and satire, and the whole bit about pastiche. Cookie Clicker started as a parody game, right? It was meant to parody idle games, right? But because the functioning is exactly the same, what it becomes instead is the most successful idle clicker game that ever existed, right? Because the parody doesn't function, because the functioning of the thing is the thing, right? And there's also this kind of aspect of spatiality that I found very interesting, right? What is cyberspace as a space? Because the kind of fantasy of Neuromancer and of what cyberspace is, right, and the kind of fantasy that kind of drives simulated space technology is this idea of a total simulation, right, which encompasses all the sense, and in which you can sort of move in a way that doesn't require movement in this space, right? But I think that's to kind of posit, it's not to see the sort of various spatialities as immanent, because what you see instead is that like in a traditional video game, because you're only moving the thumbs, the space inside the screen can be as large as you want, right? But with Pokemon Go, right, because the way you control the avatar is to move your body around space, the space of the virtual space itself has to become a much closer mirror of the real space, of the possible ways that the body can be articulated in space in order to produce the input of the avatar in the virtual space, right? And it's the same, and it's exactly the same with VR technologies, right? The VR technology wants to be this jack-in thing, but what it said is that because it requires far more embodied input, the space inside the virtual system itself has to one-to-one match more the space available to the body. And so there's actually, I think, in terms of spatiality with cyberspace, there's instead this thing where the less input is required, the larger the virtual space can be, and the more it can actually resemble this kind of fantasized VR space sort of thing. And so I think that spatiality in terms of like cyberspace and, well, at least a sort of rendered visible, this is the thing, a visibly rendered cyberspace is like not quite how it's seen in like Neuromancer and stuff, right? And I think that's kind of important.
Oh, great.
If I could build on that, actually, I completely agree, especially in terms of the idea, that cyberspace is this mapping of the world. We can sort of step into it. It ignores in a way that cyberspace is only one mapping that we're engaging with at any one time. Because I'm just thinking about sort of the work of Catherine Malibu, particularly the way she talks about the brain. And she talks about the brain essentially as if the brain has not as if, her theory is the brain fundamentally is not like in an imminent or immediate connection with the body in sort of the most unfiltered sense. Rather, the brain has a neurological mapping of the body. And it's that mapping which makes possible certain phenomena, such as, say, where people have had limbs amputated, they get a phantom pain in that limb. You can feel something that isn't there because the territory of the body may be different than the neurological mapping of it, which essentially assigns affects into different areas. And I think this is why, of course, as you're saying with Pokemon Go, augmented reality is a bit better at this whole feedback loop. But as you said, the idea of the jack in to the Oculus Rift or something, it's never going to be properly integrated until they can put it in our brains, which they're never going to be able to do, thank God. And we shouldn't pay them to do it, even if they could do it, because there's way better things to pay things down. But another aside, essentially the mapping in cyberspace is competing with the brain's mapping of the body. It has to be more subtle. The best example of this is the fact that you just got to get pretty fucking blazed to wear a VR helmet without throwing up. Like, if everyone's put these things on, it's an anti-nausea drug. I've been to sites, they recommend this, light up, like it's the only way you're going to do this for more than 30 minutes without puking. Because you put on these goggles and you move throughout cyberspace. You don't usually have space to move with your feet, so sometimes you just move with like a joystick on the pad, and you start feeling really queasy really quickly because your brain sort of is processing the idea of motion, and yet you're standing still. Then there should be the perfection of the intensive voyage. It's not, because it's two maps fighting each other. The screen, the stuff we're doing here, can allow the brain to kind of, for example, the phone. The idea of the phenomenon of people feeling their phone vibrate when it's in the other room, that's a way to gradually habituate the brain to having these kinds of extensions. Or if you go to David Chalmers' extended mind theory, we can outsource our memories to our phones, or at least to the cybernetic systems our phones give us access to. We can get a new phone. It's the account that really has the aspect here, and it is these two mappings really meeting against each other in a way that we really can't. Well, so far we haven't been able to overcome, and maybe with a good reason. But I actually want to bring up another. There's a brilliant discussion on page 157 with Fisher, this guy Bogard, and their theory of the profile. And I think we can map the profile onto an account. I'm just going to quote the Fisher in here. I'll just drop it in the chat. I apologize, I haven't been doing that as much. This is page 157. The profile is a prophecy which fulfills itself, or at least makes any claim about its accurate representation of reality undecidable. Since being profiled automatically makes you targeted by advertisers, the police, etc., it is impossible to decide whether the profile solicits bad behavior or anticipates it. And this is really the way of extending the map of the body through the profile, through a kind of like a front. Literally like a front where we launder ourselves into cyberspace, the bits we want people to see, and depending on how addicted we get to it, sometimes we don't necessarily want them to see because we get like angry or something. And it is absolutely this idea of spatiality writ large into ultimately writing, rather than this fantasy of the spatial, the diving in through the screen that you'd get in a film, so like Videodrome, you know.
You know, that often makes me think too. I mean, the point I'm about to make is slightly different, but is definitely connected. And I might have talked about it in a previous reading group session somewhere, but how many of you out there maybe purchased one of the sites that I use to purchase used books is Thrift Books. Maybe you've used it as well. And I remember in particular instances where they would send me an email saying, could you please review your upcoming delivery? I haven't received the product yet, which I purchased, yet I'm supposed to provide 4 or 5 stars for it. And it's almost as if my responsivity as a consumer on that particular platform and, you know, the indexes by which I am to measure their product and, you know, of course, which they are in turn measuring my responsivity, precedes the actual receipt of the item which I have purchased, which I think somewhat answers the question here, because I think there's a kind of ongoing subjection that occurs through this kind of, you know, incessant, you know, uptake of information, this incessant quizzing, this is incessant demand for reviews and so forth. And I think is most ironically typified in being asked to review something that you actually haven't received the product for yet. And I think part of the question is answered here, because I think it is a solicitation ultimately, like in the absence of the product. And, you know, I've been, you know, they are soliciting the review from me and, you know, want me to, in some sense, complete the determination of the quality of that interaction. And I don't know, to me, that's a bit of a kind of proof of the concept here that's being addressed. Yes. So where are we? We are at 12 minutes past the hour. Let's talk about Black Mirror, perhaps. I think the one thing that we should get out of this is the discussion of the concept of Black Mirror. I think that idea visually and ironically, like, kind of sends home the point about metaphors that we were talking about. And I'm just flipping back to page 142 here, where it says, what is cyberspace? And there's the reference for count 0. But underneath that, Fisher says, but what then does the Black Mirror show us, if not our own reflections? In part, the Black Mirror is another image of cyberspace, blackout, the catatonic neuroelectronic void, or cutout of conscious signal we have already discussed. The Black Mirror then is the image of the noumenal event horizon beyond which we cannot go, what we always are in the other world. We are already in. But the Black Mirror is also an image of cyberspace itself, like Borges' map. The Matrix is an enormous simulation that has absorbed the world into it. To me, this is like just a fantastic image to walk away from this text with. And I mean, most certainly in some sense informs, you know, the current Black Mirror series, especially, you know, that we see on Netflix, especially in the sense that I think now, you know, think about the way science fiction has changed over time, where, you know, there was a kind of futurism or, you know, like a sort of long-term speculation about what the future might be in the year 1995 or the year 2000. And it seems that the gap now between, you know, the speculative future and the now and the kind of narratives that we're telling ourselves resist in some sense a kind of metaphor in that, like the very episodes that were released on Black Mirror, well, like 2 weeks ago, I don't know, spoiler alert, very soft spoiler, Joan is awful. If you've seen it, this idea that, media companies can, use your likeness in perpetuity in conjunction with some, end user license agreement that you clicked a checkbox on years and years ago when you subscribed to the Netflix service, means that 2 years from now that they can use your image to create a series where you are included as one of the background characters, the NPCs or the protagonists, without you asking those sorts of things. And now these are the things that are being debated and fought against right now in the actors' strike. I think that's actually, in some ways, a good example of how science fiction in our time isn't about, representing what the future holds for us, but actually addresses the exigencies now and the threats and the very powerful risks that we confront with the emergence of AI technologies and so forth. So that's my whole take on the Black Mirror thing, but I don't know if anybody else came away with something. And I don't know how this happened, but somehow Siri came on while I was talking about that, and she's taking notes. What the hell's going on there? Before we wrap things up today, are there any other questions, comments,
Oh,
concerns?
wait, no, we have a hand up
Oh, go
from
for
Tom.
it. Tom, sorry, I didn't see you.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just like it's not about the Black Mirror, but I'm just very interested in the metafiction or aspects in this chapter and how the claim that Fisher makes that like a sort of spiraling metafiction that is a kind of, because I'm interested in the idea of the implex, the fiction as an implex in reality, but then the articulation of an implex within a fiction being this kind of spiraling metafiction of like this endless strange loop, like an Escher painting, is not an immanence of fiction to reality, Fisher claims. He says it's tempting to read fiction performing that spiraling as a sort of immanence of fiction to reality. Obviously, the fiction is immanent to reality, but what he's saying is not a depiction of that immanence within the fiction itself in its relationship to reality. And I'm kind of just like, I just wondered if you guys had anything to say about the kind of whole discussion of metafiction and its relationship to understanding the relationship between the fiction and the real in terms of cybernetics. Well, because that was just part of the chapter that I really found interesting.
Did you happen to hear the episode?
Well, there's a term hovering over this. Oh, sorry.
I'll just say this quickly, Adam. Well, one of the things that I'll bring to it, and Adam, certainly do your take, but I don't know if you remember the episode that we did with someone we called The Stranger. It was on psychoanalysis. On Twitter, they go by DC Barker. Maybe you've seen them. I don't know. But one of the things that he said was that there is a kind of banality to this notion of hyperstition. I think that maybe goes hand in hand with this idea of, metafiction here. And one of the ways that I look at it, and the reason I bring that up is he's a practicing counselor or therapist. And so this idea of hyperstition is actually undertaken in the therapeutic space by him, but in a way that doesn't have all the sexiness of like the sort of like cybernetic metaphors. And I think there is something true about that, especially given the work that I've done on like James Hillman and things like that. And I think about, for example, the kind of fictions that we tell ourselves in a therapeutic space are not representations, but they are performances in the sort of Dionysian sense of things, that when we tell a certain dream in our own voice, and then we respond to that dream by introducing new images, what we're experiencing is the shifting of masks, these dramatis personae, in the sort of Dionysian sense of things. We become polytheists in that space. We live through the masks of different gods. And in doing so, we get a chance to make a break with the ordinary continuity of our habituated, subjected lives under, the system that we live within, and get to create a rupture where we tell the story and we have a little bit of agency. So there's a way in which I think about all of that, hyperstition and the idea of metafiction in that sense. And that makes it a little bit more intelligible to me somehow. And I haven't found a place where the metaphor breaks down yet, but maybe Adam can do that work for me right now.
Well, there's a word hovering over this, which I think we should probably mention for the sake that I'm surprised that Fisher didn't just write the word hyperstition. It's the hyperstition is hovering over this. I mean, there's an interview that, again, apologies, Nick, that twat, did on hyperstition. And he defines it like this: hyperstition is a positive feedback circuit, including culture as a component. It can be defined as the experimental technoscience of self-fulfilling prophecies. Essentially, you input a code, an image, you produce it, send it into the circuit of distribution, these media, and then it can essentially gradually create itself as reality. So he gives an example here. Abrahamic monotheism is also highly potent as a hyperstitional engine. By treating Jerusalem as a holy city with a special world historic destiny, for example, it has ensured the cultural and political investment that makes the assertion into a truth. Hyperstition is thus able, under favorable circumstances whose exact nature requires further investigation, you should probably guess he didn't do that, to transmute lies into truths. Essentially, a fiction having efficacy, it makes even more sense in the field of finance capital in a way. For example, I mean, does anyone remember when it was, I can't remember what the name of the, like Eltree or something, there was this, there's a pharmaceutical company in the States that sold insulin, and I can't remember the name, for God's sake, it doesn't matter. Eli Lilly, that's it.
That's it.
And so when Musk basically, when anyone could buy a blue tick, it's not a matter of verification anymore, he detached the sign from standing in for a real that's outside of Twitter, and essentially made it an equivalent to a sign in the form of monetary value, completely detached from any reality. It became kind of hyper real, maybe in the worst way possible. Someone made a fake account, called themselves Eli Lilly, changed their profile picture to the logo, bought a blue tick, said, "Oh, insulin is now going to be $1 a vial." The stock price of the real company fucking crashed. In a way, it didn't crash so much they had to do it, but I think this is the idea of fiction having a kind of efficacy. It's always had a kind of efficacy. This isn't something new, but it's new in the sense of how fast you can do it and how fast media penetrates into people's way of verifying reality ultimately. So the idea of a metafiction, we can even think about it in terms of going back to Tom, your example of Pokemon Go, QAnon. People read this as an augmented reality game. It doesn't make itself real in the sense of anything they refer to as real, but people more or less act like it is real, and this is where you get the truly sort of violent, horrible kinds of stuff here. I maybe I'm giving it too much of a weak sense of hyperstition here, but I think this is very much what Fisher is referring to, or it's what is sort of bubbling up in the ideas of the CCRU here, and that's why they're trying to sort of do a William Burroughs thing of setting out like a semiotic word virus, which can make in a way, sort of communism is also in a way kind of hyperstitional. It speaks to something which isn't real, but the idea is therefore to produce it as reality. It's an infectious idea. It's the spectre haunting Europe, but it's never. But it's not because it's dead, but because it's an entirely new way of life, which for them ultimately is going to be something completely a new form of life, which is a different distinction between life and death, because it's going to be this pure machinic libertarian explosion. I mean, they never really say communism that much. Early Land is a bit more leftist than this, but this will definitely feed into Fisher's eventual acid communism, because Fisher was a communist. Some people will say that Fisher's not a communist. His last book was Acid Communism. He very much sort of threw himself into that term.
Yeah. It makes me think of I don't know if you're familiar with the billionaire Nick Hananauer, but several years ago, when we were on the precipice of losing capitalism sometime after the 2008 crash, he basically, issued a warning to his class collaborators, like, hey, if we don't get our shit together as the bourgeoisie, they're coming with the pitchforks. And I thought that was interesting because, one of the fundamental presuppositions that undergirds the maintenance of their own power is that in the absence of their power, communism is coming. That's how powerful that hyperstition is that at the sort of liminal edge of capitalism's terminus, awaits, the red plenty, or I don't know, communism is coming. And I mean, maybe it's not. I mean, I don't know. I tend to think that, something like communism would be quite on the way, in the collapse of capitalism, but it could be a kind of warlordism. It could be a kind of fascism. Who knows? But, this is certainly, I would say that the power of that narrative has infused even the billionaire class, as they say.
The reason why I'm asking is because I've been trying to write an essay about the way tragedy functions in video games for a while, because I think it's different to the way that tragedy functions in every other medium. And Fisher, in one of the footnotes, points out that tragedy is a genre that has already sort of incorporated the prophet, because this discussion of prophecy and self-fulfilling prophecy, and the inability within fiction to, once you involve that time loop, right, you end up in the position of being unable to distinguish whether the prophecy caused itself or not, right? And that's that kind of like, that hyperstitional looping thing. But yeah, anyway, I don't know. Just like, so I'm just very interested in tragedy as a genre that already, why is it tragedy? That does that. But anyway, that's by the by. Yeah.
No, that's cool. I'll mention as an aside, did you happen to hear the Machine Ink Unconscious Happy Hour episode on Leibniz? They talk about the notion of incompossibility, and Cooper talks about one of the stories in Dune. Maybe Adam, do you know the one that I'm talking about, where the protagonist's wife dies? There's so many realities in which the wife must die, but there are realities where the outcome is better than some others. And I don't know, like, I'm just hearing a little bit of what you're saying there. Like, it was just a sort of like interesting, like, plot point against a theoretical concept that you might be working with or adjacent to. Like, you might want to check that out if tragedy's on your mind.
Thanks.
Would highlight another good line, page 159, is about prophecy. One second, let me post it in there. The prophecy, like the opinion poll, is not causally, not casually, causally innocent. It combines anticipation with determination in such a way as to make the distinction between the two impossible to make. I mean, this is control. This is a control system. It's in a way, the thing we're talking about tragedy is, it's already been prophesied, it's already been determined, but something still has to happen. You still have to move through that circuit. Otherwise, in a way, the prophecy has to be circular, sort of self-confirming and self-fulfilling. And I think this is what he's talking about with control as well, because control is always about controlling things in advance. They say it's feedback, it's feed forward, but the feed forward learns through feedback. That's kind of the main piece of Antiochus, if anything. If anything, all tragedies in a cybernetic society end up being tragedies of control, because it is ultimately a confirmation. But again, I don't know how much. I don't know what sort of fear of tragedy Fisher's looking at. Is he looking at? Is he going all the way back to Aristotle? Is he moving to like the Trauerspiel essay from Benjamin? I'm not entirely sure.
Aeschylus, I don't know. I'm on a Nietzsche kick right now. Speaking of which, next month we will start the Nietzsche and Philosophy reading group that will supplant the end of the month 1,000 Plateaus reading group. And I'm hoping folks will join there. I hope it reinvigorates our Patreon too, and like gets like more people signing up with us. We've kind of hit a plateau, but I think Adam, Will, and I are a little bit burnt out from doing the book and doing all kinds of crap besides. And we all just came off a vacation, so we're going to get back on the horse and start things soon. Yeah,
I mean, after this, we've got the Neuromancer. I think I probably won't start any other. I was going to do a Sternly group. I think I've got another book to write on this. And I mean, fuck it, I might as well announce it now. There's going to be a 0 edition of this, by the way. That's going to correct some of the formal inadequacies of the ex-military. And there's going to be a new foreword to it. Not as long as the one in ex-military, don't worry. But I'll write something about connecting this to acid communism and the like. I'll keep the Nick Land to a minimum on that one, as well as the Kant. So people can look forward to reading it rather than dreading this little monolith as they get through it.
Yeah, maybe this is a good time to say too. I mean, we're kind of wrapping up, I guess. If anybody has any questions, feel free to throw them in. I haven't made the formal announcement yet, but I think everybody here knows that. I mean, we are basically working hand in hand with Tariq Goddard to find books to publish for Zero Books, but also for our particular imprint, Zero Horizons. And I think I will put out a formal statement soon in order to gather up, possible manuscripts. And there's only so many that we can really like take on at a given time, but we will definitely give everybody who has something solid a fair shake. And if we don't do it, as in Adam, Will, and I, if we're not the editors, we will pass it along to Repeater, and we'll pass it along, or we'll pass it along to Zero, which is just Tariq and some other folks who work on that side of things, and perhaps they'll look at it. And Adam, should we just tell them like some of the things that we're going to be publishing? Maybe that'll give them a sense of like what we're putting out.
So in terms of this kind of stuff, I've got a book, the New Flesh or Simulacra and Stimulation, essentially extending theories of New Flesh through Fisher's work. Also, people like Donna Haraway, Baudrillard, Deleuze, and Guattari. It's kind of updating some of the cyber theory that's come out of the last few years from people like Richard Seymour, Jody Dean, the like, from a bit more of a more in-depth cybernetic perspective rather than the more Lacanian way of doing things, which has dominated a lot of cyber theory or discussions, particularly of social media and our relationship to our data over the past 10 years. We've also got, we've got a book coming out from Ian Allan Paul, who you may know from our Prisons Computers episode. Our Prisons Computers episode. It's going to be very much still on this idea of the spectacle, but modified cybernetically to concept of the reticule, like the aiming reticule in like a video game, for example. It's very much on the sort of Kunis kind of lens. I mean, what else have we've got? I mean, there's a possible Nietzsche book coming together, I believe.
Yeah.
There might be something on Cormac McCarthy in the future. That's not set in stone yet, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited to do the book on Cormac McCarthy and neoliberalism. That may or may not come to fruition. It probably will, I'm guessing. But me, Will, Justin, if you know Justin, non-pedagogy from Twitter, and also Devin Gore, who we had on the Ask a Left Nietzsche episode, we're doing a collective Nietzsche book. The title is going to be One or Several Nietzsches. And it's going to be the way that we push back against, the sort of reductive reading of Nietzsche by certain people, that a book is coming out pretty soon. So it'll be pushing back somewhat against that. And it'll be our way of kind of having fun. And also, I think between Will and I just want to put out, I almost want to get Nietzsche out of my hair. He's just been like in my hair for too long. So I just want to write something about him, get it off, and then who knows, get on to something else. I don't know, Derrida, Walter Benjamin. I don't know what I'll do next, but that's our MO for now. So, and we want more women authors and women presenters too. So if we reached out to you in the past, or if you know women who want to be on our show, this has been like a perennial challenge, like you get in a bottleneck of dudes sometimes. And so we want to, open up the space so that people can utilize our resources, to have their voices heard and get on either Zero or get on Asset Horizon. And we'd love to, if you have ideas for episodes too, if you've been coming to, like our reading groups and stuff, and like you want to pop in on something, and we know you fairly well, and we've kind of talked with you a little bit, shoot us an idea for an episode, and we'll try to schedule something over the next year, get you on.
Absolutely.
Sound good? Cool. All right. Well, with that said,
Okay.
I have to go do some laundry, but it was wonderful seeing everybody.
Yep. And I'll see people at the Bataille thing in about half an hour. Okay.
Oh wait,
I might see.
what's the Bataille thing? Isn't that next week?
Bataille reading group. No, it's now.
Oh, I thought he moved it to the 22nd.
Wait, sure. We'll double check.
All right. All right. We'll check you guys next time. Yeah, it's the 22nd.
I know it's the 16th. Okay, it's today.
Okay.
No, Stuart Steve. No.
All right. We'll wrap it up.
We'll work it out.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Peace.
Catch you folks later.